Good morning, everybody. We'll get started very shortly. It's almost 10 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the important time zone, the central time zone. I just noticed the recording is in progress. I don't know if it's Chris or at Maverick, but we'll be having the opening prayer. Generally, we don't record until after the opening prayer.
No problem, Adam. Just making sure we're good to go. I'll pause it during the prayer, not to worry.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks.
Stella is here.
Okay, very good. Just checking. So good morning, everybody. It is 10 o'clock and we'll get started. We'll explain the purpose of this information session, but we'd like to start with an opening prayer. And I do see that Stella Shimmons is online. Oh, yes, the recording will come back on. And so I'd like to welcome everybody this morning to this information session. My name is Adam Fiddler. I've been asked to facilitate this session as well as the other sessions leading up to the Special Chiefs Assembly on August the 28th. Of course, this is one of four sessions, two information sessions and two Q&A sessions. This is the third session. This session is an information session, and we'll give you some details on how we'll be going through the agenda for today, leading up to the Q&A later this week. But to start off, I would like to introduce, unfortunately, Deputy Grand Chief Bobby Narcisse is not able to join in person. He was called to something else urgently. So we do have a video welcome from Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse, and I'll ask Chris at Maverick if we can play that, please.
Bonjour, Wachier. I'm Bobby Narcisse, your Deputy Grand Chief for Anishinaabe Nation. Welcome to the second information session on the final settlement agreement. Now today we'll be going through the information again regarding the final settlement agreement, what's its impacts, and how is it really going to affect Anishinaabe Nation. I know that we've come to this final settlement agreement negotiations with an intervener status at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, which found the federal government guilty against discriminating against your children within child welfare. So it's within these information sessions that we hope that you are informed. We hope that you are able to also ask questions as well. There'll be a chat open that you can also put your questions in. And we'll be holding another Q&A session this Thursday. So if you have any questions on that, please join on Thursday as well. So today we are doing just an information session, just getting the whole scope of the final settlement agreement. And we hope that this will enable you to really look at what the settlement agreement really entails. A lot of it from our focus and we're interested in is the fact that remoteness is a key issue facing many of our First Nations communities across Anishinaabe Nation. And it's in these areas too that the final settlement agreement also has very important clauses which deal with remoteness top-ups and looking at needs-based funding for many of our communities, not just our fly-in, but also our road access communities. It's going to have significant changes as well to the First Nations Child and Family Services program. And it's going to look at ways of shifting more or less more authority and power and jurisdiction to the First Nations and working to develop a system that is more reflective of our culture, our languages, and our way of life. Also, our First Nations agencies are also invited to these information sessions and Q&As as well, to really look at it too, because what are some ways, those incremental ways too, that we'll really need to rebuild those relationships as well, ensure that there is communication between the First Nation and our agencies and all various service providers and moving ahead. The final settlement agreement has many components to it, And many areas include prevention funding, First Nations representative funding. All these different areas will be covered through the presentation that's going to be presented to you today. But without further ado, let's get into the presentations as well. Please, like I said, the chat box will be open for questions. And again, this Thursday, we're having another Q&A. So please, I hope that you find this information session very helpful. And I wish you well, and we'll talk to you all soon. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Deputy Grand Chief Bobby Narcisse, for the opening comments and sort of laying the framework or the foundation for the discussions today, not only today, but leading up to the Q&A session on Thursday, and then, of course, the Special Chiefs Assembly on the 28th next week. So I just, again, wanted to go through the format for today's discussion. Again, for those just joining, my name is Adam Fiddler. I've been asked to facilitate this session. We do have a number of presentations. Again, a reminder, this is one of 4 sessions. There are 2 information sessions and then 2 Q&A sessions. So this is the second information session. Today's discussion will more be presentations, presenting the information, and everybody's encouraged to post their questions in the chat box. And then on Thursday, we will have a response and answers to those questions and any other questions that may come up on Thursday. So that's the format for today's discussions. Also, on the agenda, well, I'll go through the agenda very quickly. I'm not sure if we can put it up on the screen. We started, of course, with the opening prayer, opening comments from Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse, and I'll go through a quick review of the agenda, and then we will get right into the topics. So the first thing we'll go through is an overview of the NAN engagement dates and the structure of the engagements. That'll be led by Megan Daniel with Faulkner's, Kennedy Ling with NAN Social Services. Just to let you know, also, Julian Faulkner is joining by phone if required, but he will not be part of the Zoom session, but he is standing by, listening by phone. Next, we'll go into the overview of the final settlement agreement information package. There will be an overview and then the executive summary of the FSA. Megan Daniel will be making that presentation. And then we will have the technical presentation on the FSA. Again, Kennedy Ling with Nan and Megan Daniel will be doing that. We will then get into the implications of the final settlement agreement and wrapping up with closing comments. We had closing comments on the agenda from Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse. I'm not sure. We'll get details if he's able to join us or not, or whether we'll have a quick presentation as well. And then we will close with a prayer, roughly 12:30, with Stella Shimmons as well. 12:30, of course, that's Eastern time, 11:30 Central. So just a reminder that we are going across different time zones. So with that, I will turn it over to Megan Daniel and Kennedy Ling just to get into the overview of what we're doing here today leading up to Thursday. Megan. And Kennedy.
Hi, everyone. I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm Megan Daniel, and I've been working with Faulkner's with the file related to the Child Welfare Tribunal case. I'm going to let Kennedy go over the engagement dates for NAN, but just as a reminder, because it's a bit confusing. This final settlement agreement is intended, as has been said, to address the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal case. NAN was a party to that case. In addition, COO and AFM were parties to the case. And so while we're trying to settle this case, we have an agreement which is intended to settle it. Because of the way NAN chiefs are situated, they belong to NAN, they also belong to COO and AFN. So we're all 3 parties needing to agree that this final settlement agreement is what we want, which means that the NAN chiefs are in a position of voting 3 times, We'll have information sessions coming at them from 3 parties, and we'll have 3 special chiefs assemblies. So what we're going to talk about now is focusing on the NAN specific processes. Kennedy, do you want to take them through those particular dates?
Sure, yeah. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you again. So it's just a reminder, like everyone has said, today will be information and presentations, and any questions that come up during the presentations, please put them in the chat. We'll be recording them and we'll answer them on Thursday. As well, on Thursday, we'll sort of have an open dialogue session for people to come with their questions about anything in the agreement, and we will try to answer that as best as we can. So we had our first information session on July 29th, and then a subsequent Q&A on August 1st, which I think we had some good discussion and dialogue during that session that I'm hoping we can carry over into this week as well. So like Megan said, our next session will be this Thursday, the 22nd, and then our Special Chiefs Assembly next week on August 28th for NAN Chiefs. I also will draw your attention, there's a couple other engagement sessions this week as well. I believe AFN is having a session on the 22nd, and KU was having a information session on the 23rd. So if you guys want any more details, you want to hear the information from a variety of sources, those are also happening at the same time. Perfect. So I think now we can move into the overview. David, if we can get the info package up. Perfect.
Actually, David, would you show us the index page of the information package? Thank you very much. So here's the information package that you've been sent. The final settlement agreement is extremely long and detailed, and we're going to break it down to you. But for so many people, the best way to get into it is to have a big, broad overview, and then to go down into the details once you have your head around the different parts of the final settlement. So that's what we've tried to do with this information package. And so what we have is an overview of the information package to just let you know, what's this about? What's going on? Where can I get more information? And what is asked of you with regard to it? And I'll go through that overview. Next, we have a memo, which is a very high-level summary of the entire final settlement agreement, all of the parts in brief. Then we have the technical presentation. It's included in the package. You have access to it at any time. This package has been emailed. It's online. You can get it. If you can't find it, please reach out to someone. We'll send it over. And then the final part of the information package is the actual text of the final agreement. And that includes, as you see there, all the appendices and attachments that are going to be part of the agreement. So turning to the overview of the information package. So what this outlines for you is that this information package relates to the 2007 complaint that came from the AFN and the Caring Society to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. This complaint went on for quite a long time, but as you know, in January of 2016, there was a landmark ruling that there was discrimination against First Nations children in the delivery of the First Nations Child and Family Services Program, the 1965 Agreement, and Jordan's Principle. At that time in 2016, that's when NAN intervened. And they became part of the case because they wanted to bring forward a very specific but very important issue related to remoteness. Between 2016 and 2024, AFN, the Caring Society, NAN, KU, and Canada have been working together with regard to resolving that case. In July of 2024, the negotiations, the intensive negotiations that had been going on for quite a long time, resulted in an agreement, which is being referred to as a final settlement agreement. But that doesn't actually mean that the process concluded. What that means is that the negotiators have now said, this is the best agreement we can come up with amongst the parties. This is the best compromise we can reach. But it's really up to you, the leadership of the communities, to review this agreement to look at the pros and cons related to it and to decide if this is an agreement that you want to accept. And at that point, at the Special Chiefs Assembly for NAN, who has to go through the same process, AFN has to go through the same process, because these are the parties to the case that's being settled. If you want to give it your final approval, that's when you vote at the Special Chiefs Assembly. So that's an incredibly important date, August 28th, to show up and vote for the agreement or not. So if you would take me to the second page of the overview. Excuse me. So it goes through the package where in here, and it says you've got your high-level memo, you've got your presentation, you've got the full text and appendices, you've got the dates of the remaining engagement sessions. The key one is the August 22nd date for your questions stemming from this session. And it lets you know that at those information sessions, at the question and answer session, you're going to have the opportunity to ask any questions that you want to have. And that these sessions will be recorded. And finally, yet another explanation that you'll be asked to vote on this agreement 3 times, because that's a bit confusing when you're hearing the same information from different people and voting on something you already thought you voted on. So there's this additional explanation as to that. And so that these 2 pages then, in summary, provide an overview to the information package that you have before you. Do we want to move on, Kennedy, to the summary of the final settlement agreement?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Okay, so the next document is a memo, which we tried to keep it as short as possible. It's 3-4 pages. It's a concise summary of the terms of the agreement. And so what this is supposed to provide is just the basics as to what is in the agreement. It doesn't have the additional detail that the technical presentation, which Kennedy will be leading, it doesn't have that detail. This is just what are the components? What was it intended to address? So first of all, what was it intended to address? Well, it's intended to address the findings of the tribunal that there is discrimination in the First Nations Child and Family Services Program. There are other negotiations related to the other findings of the tribunal. This does not address all of the findings of the tribunal. This is simply focused on this, and it arises out of the agreement in principle. We began informing the chiefs in May 2024 of the terms of the FSA, but the final mandate from Canada came in July. And so there are some small alterations between the terms, as you might have remembered them at the Special Chiefs Assembly in May. And we'll do our best to highlight what those small changes are. And as we go through the technical presentation. So as I said, it's addressing the discrimination. It's not addressing Jordan's principle, and it's not related to jurisdiction over child welfare, for example, which was covered in Bill C-92. It does provide a floor in terms of that C-92 jurisdiction, which we'll go over later, but it's not intended, it's not focused on that. What it's focused on is that program and eliminating the discrimination within it. One of the key pieces of information, I'm sure, is the total amount of the agreement. It commits $47.8 billion over 10 years to implement the reform program. So again, this is not money that's provided as compensation to those people who are discriminated against. The compensation FSA is a different process entirely. It happened in 2023. That's when it was approved. It's a different group of people who are talking about that. This money is regarding the FNCFS program. David, would you take me to the next page? Thank you very kindly. So one of the key things that we want to highlight right off the bat, as Deputy was saying, is the remoteness provisions, because I want you to know what NAN's contribution was in terms of responding to NAN-wide concerns and what was achieved. So one of the big significant parts of the FSA is that funding, which is received through the FSA, is subject to what's called a remoteness adjustment. And this remoteness adjustment is, you might say, what is that based on? There's a methodology which was created called the remoteness quotient adjustment factor. And I'll talk more about how that was created later. But what it does is it takes the money that's coming through the FSA, it puts it through this methodology, and it adjusts that funding to reflect how far dollars go when the complication of remoteness is added. So the national average RQ adjustment is 30%, and the NAN-wide average RQ adjustment is 101%. These numbers reflect the relative remoteness of NAN First Nations. But any First Nation who is above 0.4% is going to receive some adjustment in their funding related to the added complication of remoteness to maintain that equality of services. The next thing we want to emphasize about funding is that the overall goal in terms of the funding mechanisms was flexibility. And so those are things like, as you well know, moving funding across expenditure categories or taking forward those unexpended funds into the following year. Now, this might be the key part for everybody. What are the elements of the reformed funding approach? So where is funding going and what is it going towards? So we've got a 10-year funding framework, which I'm going to pause and highlight. That's an extraordinarily long period of time for the government to agree to. You might well know, they're quite reluctant to agree to anything beyond yearly. And then getting a long agreement 4 or 5 years is often considered quite a win. A 10-year commitment is an achievement to be noted. Within the 10-year funding framework, you've got the following components. So you've got your baseline funding. And again, we're going to go over these again with detail. I'm just letting you know, going through what they are. So you've got a higher level picture. You've got your baseline funding. So your costs for operations, protection services, maintenance. You've got your prevention funding. So that's funding for prevention services to support children. And we'll go through how that prevention funding is calculated and where it's directed at. You've got your First Nations representative services. So that's money for those, what we call band rep, your band rep funding. You've got post-majority support services. So that's that money for the support that's provided to the youth who are aging out of care and young adults formerly in care up until their 26th birthday or the age of majority in the province where they are. And so this is an important source of funding for those people who are in that transition phase. We have capital funding, so funding provided for capital infrastructure to support the delivery of the program. Household support funding, funding provided to First Nations to support them to meet those basic needs so that a family can be kept together and out of care wherever that's possible. What we don't want is a simple matter of household support dividing families. We've got information technology, IT, obviously funding to support the IT needs that are related to implementing the reform program. You've got results funding. So what this means, this category is related to performance measurement frameworks and related indicators. That we want to capture all the data, we want to report that data, and so we need funding in order to support that work. And then there's emergency funding, so that's supporting responses to any unanticipated circumstances that's going to affect the provision of services. You've got a housing fund, so that's $2 billion over 5 years to support purchase, construction, and renovation of housing. And this housing renovation money, this housing fund, is for the purpose of preventing First Nations from being taken into care. It's also supposed to be used to support the reunification of families. So if housing is a barrier, hopefully this money is used to eliminate it. And then again, the remoteness adjustment. So as I was saying, there's that percentage allocation where the dollars are adjusted in order to reflect the relative remoteness of a First Nation. And it's going to apply to prevention, representative services, your band rep, post-majority support, household supports, IT, results, and emergency. So those are the basic funding components. But outside of the funding components, we've got other elements of the FSA I want to highlight to you. You've got the role of agencies and agency accountability. And so here, what we're talking about is some changes between the role of communities and agencies in the delivery of services. So agency accountability is one of the principles of the FSA. And to improve accountability, there were some provisions that were developed. And in lots of cases, these agencies were already doing these things, but now it'll be a bit of a more uniform application. And so what you're going to see is that agencies are required to co-develop a child and community wellness plan with their First Nations. They're going to be required to collect certain data. They're required to do certain reporting. We've also got an eye to the ongoing reform of the program. And so what we didn't want to have happen is a wide swath of reforms and then no ability to monitor and adjust. And so what was put in place is what's called the Reform Implementation Committee, or what you'll sometimes hear people call the RIC. So this is members that are appointed by the parties that are established to oversee, monitor, and make recommendations on the implementation of the program. NAN has 3 seats on the RIC. The RIC is intended to do 2 program assessments. One is going to happen about at the 5-year mark, and one is going to happen at about the 10-year mark. What the assessments are intended to do is review and document the program's progress towards the elimination of discrimination. In addition to this RIC, there are also other reform measures in place. So there's a national secretariat, there's a remoteness secretariat, there's a NARC Canada remoteness table, there's a NAN Canada RQ table, and there's the 1965 agreement reform. And I highlight these to say, these are different places where there's going to be ongoing data collection and dissemination of best practices and research and ongoing conversations, national level conversations about the issues that underlie the agreement, and to ensure that ongoing reform is taking place. Finally, a really important provision is the dispute resolution mechanism. And so in the final settlement agreement, there is created a dispute resolution process. And what that means is there is a tribunal intended to resolve disputes from amongst the parties regarding the implementation of the agreement and disputes between Canada and First Nations and agencies. And so there's going to be a place to go to say whether or not something is working from the perspective of one party or another, or a First Nation or an agency, which I think is a really important place to keep in mind as we move forward, hoping that the agreement moves smoothly, but that problems may inevitably arise. So should we move on to that technical presentation?
Great, thanks, Megan. I'll start us off here. So good morning again, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Kennedy. I work as a senior policy analyst in social services at NAN. So I'll start us off in the presentation today. I also just want to draw attention to the fact that we are recording and we will post this recording online. So if you have people you know who weren't able to attend this time, I know everyone's really busy, especially in the summer, they'll be able to go and watch this at any time. As well, our session from July 29th is also recorded and posted on the NAN website. So I think we can get started. David, thank you. So I'd like to start off by drawing attention to the mandate that we received from the NAN Chiefs in Assembly to undertake this final agreement. So in February of this winter, 2024, at the NAN Winter Chiefs Assembly, the Chiefs in Assembly unanimously passed Resolution 2408, which directed the NAN executive to strive to the best of its ability to achieve a final agreement without delay. It also stated that the NAN executive could only sign off on an agreement that included provisions for the full implementation of an evidence-based approach to adjusting funding for remoteness. So we'll discuss this in more detail below, and Megan introduced it for us this morning, as well as Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse. So we'll dive more into that a bit later into the presentation. But then finally, it called on the NAN executive to ensure that NAN First Nations have the opportunity to exercise their free, prior, and informed consent by having the chance to review and approve the agreement before it's brought to the Chiefs of Ontario level and the AFN level for those approval processes. So this is, as Megan explained at the start, why the NAN Chiefs, due to their unique status, NAN's unique party status in this case, have to vote on this agreement 3 times because they're member First Nations of these 3 different levels of organizations. So that leads us into the next slide. So we talked a bit about this at the beginning, about the upcoming engagements. So we are halfway through our engagement sessions. We started these virtual sessions on July 29th. We had a Q&A on August 1st. Now August 19th and August 22nd are our next sessions. I have also, we have now confirmed the Chiefs of Ontario assembly dates, which are September 10th and 11th, and those are virtual only. And September 17th to 19th is a hybrid assembly in Winnipeg for AFN. And like we've said earlier, the NAN Special Chiefs Assembly will be August 28th, next Wednesday. Finally, if all those processes result in approvals, we would anticipate bringing a motion to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, who have to then approve the agreement themselves. So that would be contemplated likely fall 2024, following all these ratification processes. So I also want to draw attention to the fact that in May, the 22nd and 23rd, NAN had an in-person Special Chiefs Assembly where the NAN leadership were given the opportunity to review the draft FSA in the form that it took then at that time. So like Megan said, at that time, we didn't have the final mandate from Canada. We didn't have the final version. So we shared the draft as it was in its form, and it has changed slightly since then, since we've gotten our final approvals. But following Canada receiving its mandate after that Special Chiefs Assembly, the council for the parties signed off on the draft agreement that you now have and you can see and review. And essentially what that means is that council for the parties can support and recommend the agreement, as well as the instructing clients for those parties. So this doesn't mean that NAN approved the agreement and it's being implemented. What it means is that the agreement can now be shared with all the leadership for their review and for their own decision-making processes. All it means that NAN signed off is that we support and recommend the agreement. So it provides for $47.8 billion over 10 years. It secures the groundbreaking remoteness adjustments that were embedded in the FSA that was presented in May. Megan spoke about them earlier. And like I said, it does include some changes to some sections of the agreement, and some of these will be highlighted below. So here, we'd just like to draw attention again to what this agreement doesn't cover. So it covers a lot, but it doesn't cover everything. So it's not about compensation. So when the case was brought forward, it was ordered that there be compensation for victims of the discrimination, as well as a reformed program. So the compensation agreement, which NAN was not a party to, was approved by the AFN First Nations in Assembly, the Human Rights Tribunal, and the Federal Court in 2023. The removed child class and child family class was recently approved in June, the distribution protocol for that class. So again, NAN Norcu is a party to that agreement, so that's the $23 billion compensation. So that's separate from this agreement. The agreement is not settled, is not about Jordan's Principle, sorry. So Jordan's Principle is not settled by this agreement. The AFN and the Caring Society proposed that Jordan's Principle reform be dealt with on a separate track and on its own agreement. So Jordan's principle is currently being litigated at the tribunal brought by the Caring Society. So you won't see anything about Jordan's principle reform in this agreement. The agreement is not about asserting jurisdiction. It sets a floor for First Nations who want to assert their own jurisdiction and who want to create their own laws. But if you are currently working on creating your own law, negotiating a coordination agreement, or you plan on doing so in the future, this agreement doesn't preclude you from doing so or interfere in that process. It only makes sure that the floor of what you can negotiate for your own agreement is not less than what you would be entitled to under this agreement. So the agreement is only about reforming this program to address the discrimination that was found by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. And I'll hand it over to Megan for this slide.
Thanks. So I just want to go over the remoteness provisions in a little bit more detail than I had mentioned. So the idea around the remoteness adjustment. Obviously, remote communities within the Anishinaabe Nation territory and across the country were facing a structural discrimination and a lack of access to services, as when money was provided equally, it failed to address the unique challenges faced by the remote First Nations due to their remoteness. And so a key question that was examined was, how much funding would be needed to provide the same level of child and family services in remote communities as would be provided in non-remote communities? And there had to be a method to determine how to make that kind of a calculation. The method that was decided upon was an expert level report, which strongly included people and communities experiencing remoteness. And what was achieved was an evidence-based method of indexing costs to account for remoteness that can be applied so that at the end of the day, the same level of service is found in the remote community as is found in the non-remote community. This is the first time ever that this First Nation cited evidence-based methodology is going to be applied to adjust funding. And so it's one of the major achievements of the final settlement agreement. And as I said, it's not a small adjustment we're speaking about. The nationwide adjustment is 30%, and the NAN-wide average is 101%. And so I think it's not overstating it to say that this is groundbreaking as well as exciting in terms of a new bar for accounting for remoteness and ensuring that substantive discrimination ends. I'll turn it back over to you, Kennedy.
Great, thank you. So we'll go over some background quickly just to sort of contextualize where we are and how we got here. So the original complaint alleging discrimination was brought by the Assembly of First Nations and the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society in 2007. So that's when they filed the complaint against Canada, saying Canada was discriminating against First Nations children. It took 9 years for the tribunal to issue the decision in January 2016 that Canada was guilty of discriminating against First Nations children, youth, and families on reserve through the way they were administering the First Nations Child and Family Services Program, as well as through the 1965 agreement and Jordan's Principle. And so just to quickly give you a bit of background on what the 1965 agreement is it's a cost-sharing agreement between Canada and Ontario that was signed in 1965. And what it does is it allows Ontario to extend certain social services on reserve to First Nations, and they're then reimbursed by Canada. So what that means is in child and family, the Ontario government is the point of contact for child and family services agencies in Ontario instead of the federal government. And the two layers of government deal with the payments between themselves. So that's different than in the rest of the country. So that's why the 1965 agreement had specific findings and orders related to it. So in May 2016, NAN intervened in the remedy stage of the proceedings in order to make sure that the unique discrimination that was found by the tribunal that remote First Nations were facing was adequately addressed and remedied so that it did not reoccur and it didn't continue. So between 2016 and 2021, following the decision and before negotiations started taking place, the tribunal issued a series of interim and immediate orders. So these were to begin immediately remedying the discrimination while a long-term approach was negotiated. So during this time, they ordered Canada to reform the program as well as the 1965 agreement. They made various Jordan's principle orders, and they also made orders to compensate victims of discrimination. So in 2021, negotiations really ramped up in November, and the parties, so the AFN, the Caring Society, NAN, Chiefs of Ontario, and Canada, negotiated what's called an agreement in principle, which is essentially a framework for how you're going to get to a long-term agreement to reform the program. So on December 31st, 2021, so this is 5 years after the decision and 14 years since the original complaint was filed in 2007, they signed this agreement. And what the agreement did was it was supposed to set out how we would negotiate the reform of the program and the reform of Jordan's principle. So at this time, they had not yet been separated. The AIP committed Canada to providing $19.8 billion over 5 years to reform both the program and Jordan's principle. It also committed Canada to ensuring that remoteness issues are adequately addressed, to support Choose Life, as well as to fund the National Assembly of Remote Communities. It also committed all the parties who signed to reach a final agreement on reform of both the program and Jordan's principle by December 31st, 2022. So following the signing of the AIP between January and the following December 2022, the parties negotiated, but they didn't reach a final agreement on long-term reform. So all the parties extended their negotiation mandates and kept working on a long-term approach. In March of 2023, the Caring Society and the AFN proposed negotiating the program reform and Jordan's principle reform separately. So there would be 2 final agreements, one on FNCFS and one on Jordan's principle. And the reasoning behind this was we're still currently waiting on more evidence from the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, who are doing research on the best ways to reform Jordan's principle. They also did research on the reform of the program, which formed a lot of the basis of the funding structure that you'll see in the AIP, as well as in this agreement. So like I mentioned, the 1965 agreement reform was ordered by the tribunal because of Ontario's unique role in the child welfare sphere since 1965. So because the tribunal ordered that the 1965 agreement be reformed, NAN and COO have that to do as well. So in August 2023, from a mandate from the NAN chiefs, NAN secured a seat at the 1965 agreement reform table when it begins that work. So NAN, alongside with COO, will be an equal party to renegotiating that agreement. So in October 2023, so this is following the Caring Society and AFN proposing the split of Jordan's principle in the program, Canada accepted that proposal to negotiate separate agreements. So this is when we began negotiating solely on the program. And when Canada got this mandate, they also informed us that they only received a mandate to achieve a final agreement by the end of June on the program. So due to this, NAN, COO, and AFN came together and proposed a schedule and agenda that set out some quite intensive negotiations. So in order to reach the agreement by the deadline we'd been given, we essentially decided that we had a lot to accomplish and we had to meet almost every week from January to May in order to get this done. So that schedule was accepted by Canada. Also in December 2023 was when the Caring Society filed their Jordan's Principle non-compliance motion, and they stepped aside from the structure agreed to in the agreement in principle in order to do that. So between January and May of 2024, NAN, COO, the AFN, and Canada intensively negotiated the draft agreement that you now have, and which is now subject to decision by political leadership. So in February 2024 is when the NAN chiefs passed that resolution that we discussed at the beginning, which directed the executive to pursue an FSA without delay. In May 2024 was when we held the Special Chiefs Assembly that I discussed to allow the leadership the opportunity to review and be informed on the draft agreement. And in July 2024, July 10th, Canada received a final mandate, and along with NAN, COO, and AFN, finalized a draft FSA for leadership engagement and approval. So here we'll just go over some high-level effects of the draft FSA if approved. So it will increase the annual funding provided under the program. It will improve accountability between agencies and First Nations. It will transition away from the actuals funding processes that are currently in place, which will then be released by the funding structures contemplated in the agreement. It will set that groundbreaking new bar to accounting for remoteness. It will set a floor for First Nations who are asserting jurisdiction. It will secure the gains that have been made since 2016 all the way through to March 31st, 2034 at the end of the 10-year term. And it will also supersede related human rights tribunal orders and settle this part of the case. So to reiterate, if approved, the draft agreement will only settle orders related to the program. It won't settle or supersede orders that are related to Jordan's Principle, as that is not contemplated in this agreement, and that's on a separate track right now. So we'll go into a bit of detail here about the new funding amounts. So we'll start off with the funding that is for First Nations. So prevention funding is calculated at $26,0355 per resident on reserve. And $75,000 is the minimum any First Nation can receive. So if a First Nation has a small population and their per capita amount results in less than 75,000, they're bumped up to make sure they get that base amount. And that funding is intended to support children and families, promote well-being, and prevent contact with the child welfare system for children. So this funding has actually been going out since April 1st, 2022, and it's been adjusted upwardly for inflation since then. So in the agreement, if approved, it will be adjusted annually for inflation, population, and remoteness. So there's a small remoteness adjustment now. The full remoteness adjustment, if the agreement is approved, would begin April 1st, 2025. First Nation Representative Services, so BANREP services, that funding is calculated based on a First Nation's previous actual expenditures as well as per capita rates. Again, with that 75,000 base amount. So any First Nation who has a small population who their per capita doesn't result in at least 75,000, they are bumped up to that. And what that funding is for is supporting representatives of First Nations in addressing matters related to the delivery of services to their citizens who are getting services from a child welfare agency. We've also seen First Nation reps are doing tons of work, especially in Native communities, including prevention and things like that. So this funding is to support band rep programs. And it's adjusted annually if the agreement is approved for inflation, population growth, and remoteness, with that starting April 1st, 2025. Post-majority support services. The funding will be calculated based on a per eligible youth rate, and the funding amount was determined using regional household spending data. And the full approach to post-majority, and you'll see this in the draft agreement, is currently still being discussed between the parties. And the reason behind that is because we're trying to really figure out the best way to make sure we have the proper data for youth who have transitioned out of care. So that funding is intended to support youth who are either approaching the age of majority and young adults up to age 26 who have transitioned out of care. And that funding, if the agreement is approved, would be adjusted annually for inflation, population, and remoteness. And then we have what are called the top-ups. So the way these top-ups are calculated is a First Nations affiliated agency has what's called a baseline budget, which is made up of their essentially core operating costs. So that funding is then used to form the basis of these top-ups. So you add the percentage on top of the baseline for the whole agency, and then that amount is split between all the First Nations affiliated with that agency. So the first is for information technology. So this funding can support IT needs related to the implementation of the program. And so that forms 6% of baseline funding. And again, that's split between the agency's First Nations based on their population. And that funding would be adjusted annually for inflation, population, and remoteness. The results top up, 5% of baseline funding. And that's to support capturing data and to support reporting requirements for the implementation of the new program. And that is adjusted annually for inflation, population, and remoteness. And finally, the emergency top-up. So the emergency top-up is a total of 2%. And for the First Nations, it's 1% of baseline funding, and the agency receives the other 1%. And that's to support responses to sort of unanticipated circumstances that affect child and family services. That will be adjusted annually for inflation, population, and remoteness. And then we have household supports top-ups, and how that's calculated is it's based on a First Nations share of the total national population that are living in low-income households on reserve. And it's intended to support helping to meet the basic needs of families that, if go unmet, could lead to children coming into contact with a child welfare agency or being taken into care. So it's adjusted annually for inflation, population, and remoteness. Capital funding is the total pot was calculated based on prior actual expenditures as well as cost data for new builds. The capital infrastructure is intended to support the delivery of FNCFS programming, so things like prevention, protection, things like that. And that is an application-based approach. So this is the only application-based approach in the agreement. And the parties are currently determining the exact parameters and criteria for how that application will look. We're trying to make it as barrier-free as possible. And then we have housing funding. So a bit of the housing funding went out last year already. So over the next 4 years, there's 1.79 billion to be divided among First Nations across the country. So every First Nation receives a $250,000 base amount. Then you add on a formula, which is based on your population, your rates of overcrowding, as well as the remoteness of a First Nation. And that housing funding is an attempt to support meeting housing needs of families and beginning to address that structural driver of the lack of safe and suitable housing that oftentimes can lead to children being taken into care. And then we have the funding for agencies. So agencies receive baseline funding, which is based on their previous actual expenditures. And it's essentially their costs for operations, protection services, maintenance of children in care. And it will be adjusted annually for inflation and population growth. Agencies currently also receive prevention funding, which is also $2603.55 per resident on reserve. And similarly to when we discussed that funding for First Nations, it's to support children and families, promote well-being, and prevent the need for protection services and interventions. And it's adjusted annually for inflation, population, and remoteness. And like I said before, there's a small remoteness adjustment to that funding now, and the full remoteness adjustment would begin April 1st, 2025. There's then again the emergency top-up, which is 1% of their baseline funding, which is to support responses to unexpected circumstances that affect services to children. That's adjusted annually for inflation and remoteness. And capital funding. Like I said, the application-based capital funding, First Nations agencies have access to that as well. So we'll get a little more in depth into prevention funding here. So that's the $2603.55 per capita rate. And right now, how it works is the prevention funding that is attributed to a First Nation is shared between the First Nation and their affiliated agency. So there's a split between them. Between April 1st, 2024 and March 31st, 2026, the prevention funding will remain shared between First Nations and agencies across the country. Beginning April 1st, 2026, there'll be a shift. So in Ontario, that split will remain as the default. So agencies and First Nations will share the prevention funding as the default. However, if First Nations want to take over the delivery of their own prevention services, they can elect to reallocate their prevention funding to themselves. So either to opt to take all of their prevention dollars and deliver their own prevention services, or to have a different split with their agency. So it's really up to First Nations on what level of prevention services they want to deliver, or if they want to keep their agency funded and continue to deliver prevention services to them. So that's a bit different. So outside of Ontario, First Nations as a default will receive all prevention funding as the default, and they will have to elect to either give some funding back to their agency or reallocate it in a different way. So it really just gives First Nations the choice in how they want to be funded to deliver prevention services and if they want to take on the full delivery of these prevention services. So then we get into band rep services funding. So you'll see that band rep funding in the agreement is called First Nation Representative Services. So if you're looking for band rep, it will be under anywhere you see First Nation Rep Services. You'll also notice, and I want to draw attention to this, that Ontario has essentially very different funding for band rep than the rest of the country, due to the order that we'll talk about in a minute, as well as the long history of the program in Ontario. So if you're looking at those provisions in the agreement, just make sure you're looking at specifically the Ontario clauses, because they do differ from the rest of the country. So in 2018, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ordered Canada to fund the actual costs of band rep services in Ontario. So Canada complied and funding began to be available at actuals to First Nations in Ontario, I believe began in 2019. So in 2022, after those years of actuals, Canada began providing band rep allocations at the start of the year to First Nations. And what those allocations were was the highest annual amount that they had claimed through actuals in 2019-2020 or 2020-21, or a per capita rate of $376 or a base amount of $75,000. So it's the highest of those three options. And the reason that it was determined to be like this was so that if a First Nation hadn't yet accessed actuals, there was still a per capita rate that was determined based on looking at the actuals claimed by the First Nations who had access to them, just to make sure it wasn't, or tried to ensure that it was as fair as possible. So even if a First Nation hadn't accessed actuals, they would still have a per capita rate, or if with a small population, no access to actuals, they still had a base amount of $75,000. So during that time and still now, First Nations in Ontario have access to actuals for band rep until March 31st, 2025, if they expend 75% of their allocation. Currently, that funding is not adjusted for remoteness at all because it's on an actuals application basis. So from April 1st, 2025, according to the agreement, if the agreement were to be approved, a First Nations band rep funding would be their highest annual funding amount from 2019-2020 to 2022-23, adjusted annually for inflation and remoteness. So that means it would be, if you look at 22-23, either the highest annual amount claimed through actuals, a per capita rate of $376.41, or $75,000. And I'll hand this one back over to Megan.
Hi, so just a few further details with regard to the RQ adjustments. As we've said, these adjustments will be applied to the prevention, the band rep services, the post-majority support services, IT, results, emergency, and household supports funding. All of these categories, therefore, will be subject to the RQ adjustment, which increases the costs, or which estimates the increased costs associated with remoteness and adjusts those funding to account for those increased costs. Something important to note about this. This is based on strong evidence about how remoteness affects the costs of providing child welfare services and requires these significant increases in funding relative to non-remote communities, and how the challenges faced by the First Nations in remote areas are magnified, and that the level of funding has been and continues to be disproportionately low relative to the needs of these communities. And so what it's hoping to resolve, as I said, is those systemic barriers that are contributing to an increased need for child welfare services compared to the non-remote communities. And at the end of the day, further research is needed to better understand the additional costs, but this is an incredible start. And it is a significant improvement over other figures that have been proposed, as we have at the bottom of the slide. The IFSD proposed a 2 to 8% adjustment, and what we ended up seeing was a nationwide average of 30% and a nationwide average of 101%. So not even close on.
Perfect. So we just want to draw attention to this slide that if, like I said before, if the agreement is approved, the current actuals funding processes that are open would end on April 1st, 2025, and be replaced by the funding structures contemplated in this agreement. So that includes agency costs for intake and investigations, legal fees, and building repairs. Actuals would end and agencies would receive baseline funding. Post-majority support services, that actuals process would end and be replaced by the post-majority allocation. Band rep services in Ontario, those actuals processes would end and be replaced by the allocation we had just discussed, the First Nations highest annual amount between 2019, 2020 and 22-23, as well as capital for FNCFS. So it would transition away from the actuals Order 41 process that currently is in operation, and it would move to an application-based process determined by the parties to the agreement. So the deadline to submit those actuals claims for 24-25 will be September 20th, 2025. So you can spend your actuals until April 1st, and then you can get reimbursed for them until September 20th. So another non-monetary part to this agreement is that to improve accountability to affiliated First Nations, agencies will have increased requirements that include co-developing with their affiliated First Nations multi-year child and community well-being plans. And what those plans will incorporate are priorities of their First Nations, mechanisms to facilitate information sharing between the First Nation and the agency, how the First Nation and agency will have an integrated approach to service delivery. So how are they going to work together with both First Nations and agencies being in this sphere of child and family services, as well as requirements for agencies to report to their affiliated First Nations. Agencies will also collect data and report to their First Nations on community well-being indicators and the implementation of their co-developed plans. So how they're meeting the priorities and things set out in the co-developed plan. So NAN would have an ongoing role in the reform of the program following the signing of the agreement. So through the Reform Implementation Committee, the RIC committee, NAN would have 3 seats on the RIC to oversee, monitor, and make recommendations to Canada on how the reform is going, if it's effective, if there are issues with the reform, how it could be better, things like that. NAN would sit on that committee for the 10 years of the agreement. There's also a national secretariat, which would be created, and it would be a hub for essentially data collection, would look at the data, see how effective the program is being, and they would also assist with best practices. So NAN would be a member of that national secretariat. NAN would work with the National Assembly of Remote Communities to also establish a secretariat that's dedicated to remoteness research, as well as data collection. So to continue that work that NAN has been doing on remoteness research, it would assist NARC with establishing the secretariat. The NARC Canada Remoteness Table would work with the secretariat, and they would look at addressing remoteness issues at a national level. So the National Assembly of Remote Communities and the Canada Remoteness Table. So NAN is also a member of NARC. Then the NAN Canada RQ table. So that table is a NAN specific process that has been operating since 2017, where this RQ remoteness quotient research has taken place and evolved and gotten us to the place where we are in this agreement. So that process and work will continue. And finally, as we discussed earlier, NAN will have its own seat to negotiating the reform of the 1965 agreement, along with COO, Canada, and Ontario. I will highlight that currently Canada, COO, and NAN are waiting on the Government of Ontario to engage in these negotiations. So once they come to the table, like I said, NAN will have an equal seat to COO, not just as a region of COO, to renegotiate that agreement. And I'll hand it over to Megan for the next 2 slides.
Thank you. So these next 2 slides are intended to take this enormous amount of information we're giving you and put some context to it in terms of making a decision between voting to approve this agreement or not doing so. Because what you're hearing maybe from other people or other places is that that idea that you could continue litigation as opposed to going with this negotiated agreement. And so we want to talk about what it would mean if you continued with litigation or what you got through litigation and what it means to go with the negotiated agreement, just to give you a bit of a framework to put all this information into. And so what we're talking about here is what was achieved through litigation and what was achieved through negotiation, and a bit of analysis in terms of whether or not it's significant. So with regard to prevention funding, what you get at a tribunal, I should back up for a moment. What you get at a tribunal or at a court are two things. You're going to get findings, which are statements of fact that the tribunal has decided were proven true. So if you get a finding of discrimination, then it's true there was discrimination. The other thing you get is an order, which is a direction to one party or another to do something. So we're going to talk about findings and orders. So with regard to prevention funding, there was a finding of discrimination, that the prevention funding was at a discriminatory amount, and there was an order to reform that funding category. The CHRT ordered for a period of time actuals funding for agencies. This was only between 2019 and 2022. This was actually improved on at the negotiation level, because what ended up happening was that you got a 2,500 per capita split between First Nations and agencies, which is an amount that will be adjusted for inflation. You also got an RQ adjustment that's starting in partial RQ adjustment starting in 2023 and 2024, and a full RQ adjustment that will start in 2025. And so that's a significant increase in funding, both in terms of the commitment and moving forward, a long-term goal of having prevention funding for First Nations. The post-majority support services funding. And so what you had in hand at the tribunal was a consent order to fund till 2023. And this was partially based on the AIP negotiations. What instead you got through the negotiation of the final settlement agreement, you saw actuals funding on the post-majority support services between 2022 and 2025. You got $1.9 billion for First Nations for the next 10 years between 2024 and 2034, and a full RQ adjustment starting from 2025. So why this is significant? There actually wasn't a finding of discrimination that the order was based on. And so this is a new funding commitment, something that was above and beyond what was before the tribunal, that was secured through the negotiation, and that is found in the final settlement agreement. Moving on to the next slide, housing funding. There was no order that was made with regard to housing, although there were findings of discrimination based on a lack of safe and suitable housing. This can happen sometimes. Simply because something was found discriminatory doesn't mean that an order will result to resolve it. But despite the lack of a specific order regarding housing funding, through negotiation, there was $2 billion for First Nations over 5 years between 2023 and 2028. And so that's a funding commitment, again, secured without an order. That was secured solely through the negotiation. Now, the RQ adjustments. So there were findings of discrimination based on remoteness. The tribunal did find that failing to account for remoteness amounted to discrimination. And there were orders to reform those funding formulas to account for remoteness to remedy that discrimination. That was a tribunal order. But through negotiation, you saw those adjustments actually be applied to the funding categories. You also saw the partial RQ adjustments from 2023, 2024, and full RQ adjustments starting from 2025. And so this is significant new funding commitments and a new bar for accounting for remoteness that was secured through negotiation yet again. Finally, other reforms. There were other findings of discrimination and orders to reform in other areas. However, litigation is sort of an imperfect tool in terms of trying to fashion something like a program or something concrete. Tribunals make orders that are a little bit more limited in their creativity, and a little bit more blunt in terms of how improvements can be made and systemic discrimination can be resolved. However, through negotiations, you can be creative and actually draw on the expertise of the various people at the table. And so what we saw happen in terms of other reforms, we saw that improved agency accountability. You saw the creation of the RIC, the Reform Implementation Committee. You saw the creation of an entirely new tribunal, the Dispute Resolution Tribunal, the National and Remoteness Secretariats, the Remoteness Tables, the RQ Table, and so on. And so these are structural commitments and structural reforms above and beyond just increasing funding. We're creating something entirely new, which hopefully gets at that idea that the discrimination is baked in at the structural or at the systemic level. Can we go on to the next slide as a summary? And so this is the idea, again, for context, is you're trying to weigh all of this information and you're trying to decide, is this an agreement that I want to vote for? You have to think about what you can get through litigation or continued litigation. And it can only get you so far. That there are, what we want to impart are that there are some gains that you can't win in a courtroom setting. And further, that the agreement that you have in hand, so this isn't a legal advice, this is a political view. The agreement that you have in hand is one that was gained through the current government, but that all bets are off when the government changes, which we all know is as an imminent threat. Which is why we've written here that the probability of reaching a better deal in the short or medium term is extremely low or nothing. If the government changes, what was gained through the negotiations that happened may not be there anymore. These are commitments that we currently have with this government. And so the 47.8 billion draft FSA secures those gains that were made since 2016, and it would secure them for the next 10 years. And so we've tried to isolate sort of the bottom line in terms of making this decision. It's not only, is this a deal I want to vote for and support, but it's to have an eye to the political moment to say, is now the best time to make a deal, given the deal that you have in hand. And I'll turn it back over to you, Kennedy.
Great, thank you, Megan. So just to reiterate some of the next steps we discussed at the beginning of the meeting. So we're currently in the middle of these engagement sessions. All the parties are hosting these engagement sessions. So our next Q&A period will be on Thursday, the 22nd. Please submit any questions you have either today in the chat, via the NAN website forum, or just come on Thursday with your questions and we'll try our best to answer them to the best of our abilities. As I've said, also, AFN is also having a session on the 22nd. KU is hosting a virtual session on the 23rd as well, to share information if you are interested in also attending those. And then the Chiefs of Ontario virtual Special Chiefs Assembly will be September 10th and 11th. That will be following NAN Special Chiefs Assembly, which has been scheduled for next Wednesday, August 28th. And then finally, that will culminate in the AFN Special Chiefs Assembly in Winnipeg from September 17th to 19th. And that is a hybrid assembly, so it's both in person and virtual. And then following the approvals of all those agreements, if they're all to be approved, the motion for the approval of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal would be brought likely in late fall of 2024. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending and listening. And again, like Megan said, you can find this package, including the PowerPoint, on the NAN website. And I think we will turn it back over to you, Adam.
Great. Thank you very much, Megan and Kennedy, for the presentations. And just a reminder, today's session was an information session to present the information. If you do have any questions, I do see one really good question in the chat box, but feel free at this point to get your question in there very quickly. The team will review the questions and come back on Thursday with the responses to those questions. But a really good question from Jocelyn Sutherland in the chat box. Reminder, I see that some have just joined recently, but the session is being recorded. And if you, I don't have the link, if we can share the link in the chat box so that people can share the link if you want to go back and have a look at the session, that is available. And I just want to confirm, we've gone through a number of agenda items. I'm assuming that we've discussed the implications. We have not. Okay. Okay. So again, a reminder, there's an opportunity now. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat box. So I'm going to turn it back to the team. Also, I would like to confirm that our elder is still standing by once we could come to the closing. And originally on the agenda, it was really good to have Deputy Grand Chief Bobby Narcisse join us by video at the beginning. I'm just waiting on confirmation if he is available for the closing. So with that, we'll turn it over to the implications of the FSA. Kennedy, I see you're the one that's unmuted right now, so I'm going to turn it back to Kennedy.
Thanks, Adam. So we had various requests from people at the last information session and question and answer period to do sort of a pros and cons list to accepting the agreement. So we're waiting on our final version to be formatted, and then that will be sent out and posted. But Megan and I thought we could go over some of those implications today before it's finalized to be posted online. So I am going to go through some positive effects of the agreement for you all, and then Megan will go over some of the potential downsides to the agreement. I stuck her with that. So some of the positive effects of accepting this agreement would be securing those groundbreaking remoteness adjustments that we've discussed, which result in an average of 101% upward adjustments to funding for NAN First Nations to account for those increased costs of delivering services in remote communities. So if you accept this agreement and it's implemented, those remoteness adjustments will be brought into effect. There will also be ongoing improvements to remoteness-related research through the Remoteness Secretariat and the National Assembly of Remote Communities, so that this type of work that NAN has been doing for years can continue both in NAN communities and nationally to ensure issues of remoteness are adequately addressed. Welcome, Deputy. I see the Deputy has joined us. We'll give this over to him after for his closing comments. The agreement is also the product of long-term extensive negotiations between Canada and First Nations organizations over the past several years. Like Megan said, a lot of work and a lot of expertise has gone into this agreement. The 10-year duration of the agreement is a significant commitment from the federal government to make sure that these services and these funding levels are in place over the next 10 years. The agreement also ensures that there's access to an alternative dispute resolution mechanism. And that mechanism would be open to the parties, so the parties to the agreement, COO, NAN, AFN Canada, as well as to First Nations and service providers. So unlike in the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, which right now, if there's a disagreement, only the parties have access to the tribunal. So if an individual service provider or a First Nation has an issue, they have to get one of the parties to bring it to the tribunal on their behalf. They can't go themselves, versus in this mechanism, there's a stream for First Nations and for service providers. There's also increases in program funding, including the continued funding of prevention and BANREP that has been ongoing, the new top-up funding, which is all upwardly adjusted for remoteness, substantially more than the partial adjustment, which has been made on prevention in the last 2 years. The funding is also stable over 10 years, so without the need to apply year over year. So in the actuals processes, you need to apply to Canada for either advance funding or reimbursement every year. The funding in this agreement will be stable, and it would be allocated to First Nations and to service providers. It has those increased accountability mechanisms we discussed for agencies to their affiliated First Nations to make sure those First Nations priorities are being integrated. It has an increased role for First Nations in service delivery if they so choose to take that on. So there's dedicated funding to deliver prevention services, BANREP services, post-majority services. And this is all premised on a First Nations choice to do that. If a First Nation wants to right now keep their post-majority funding, for example, with their agency and just focus on delivering prevention and BANREP, that's always an option under this agreement. So it's all about that choice on what level of services First Nations want to deliver. It also has a flexible funding model, and that allows for funding to be both reallocated between the different budget lines, as well as to be carried forward if it's unexpended at the end of the year. There's also built-in mechanisms for review. So 2 program assessments will be conducted, one at the year 5 and one nearing the end of the 10-year term, to see how effective the reforms have been and if they're working on improving the well-being of children and families. There are new governance supports, which include the establishment of the secretariats that will provide assistance with data gathering and data synthesis. There's also the positive effect that this is a negotiated agreement rather than an imposed program. So it means certainty about the terms of the agreement. So we know what the terms of this agreement will be if it's accepted. If the FSA isn't accepted, we don't know what could happen. Canada could go to the tribunal and seek an order to impose a program of their choosing. Finally, housing funding for First Nations is a positive effect of this agreement. So that housing funding, which was never ordered but was achieved through negotiations, is unlikely to continue to flow without a final agreement. So those are a few of the positive effects of accepting we wanted to go over, and I will hand it over to Megan to go through some potential downsides.
Thanks, Kennedy. Right. The potential downsides of accepting, like anything, it's often these factors aren't clear pros or clear cons, but these were the ones that we thought were most important to bring to the decision makers' attention. So if the FSA is accepted and approved by the tribunal, the orders will cease, which means that actual funding will end. The FSA will replace the access to the tribunal's orders for actuals funding with the funding formulas that are present in the agreement. So this is a potential downside of accepting. Further, as First Nations who want to develop and deliver services, there are some downsides to being a service provider, which are things like increased liability. You could have staffing issues, you could have increased reporting requirements, all of the things that go with service delivery. While it is an excellent thing to be the provider of the service and tailoring it, there are obvious problems that come that you have to deal with when you are the service provider. Another one is that the capital funding in the final settlement agreement is application-based, and it's the only category of application-based funding, but we wanted to highlight that that is an application-based funding. area. And then the final one is that the jurisdiction of the Human Rights Tribunal will cease for the parties, and the parties no longer have access to the tribunal. As I said, lots of these things cut both ways. The tribunal is very handy for certain things, but not everything can be achieved through litigation. But it is important to note as a consideration and an implication that if the final settlement agreement is approved, that the parties can no longer have access to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, but only to the Dispute Resolution Tribunal, which was created, that alternative dispute resolution model that we spoke about earlier. Those are, I think that's my recitation of the downsides.
Great. Thanks, Megan. So I think we will turn it back over to you, Adam.
Great. Thanks very much, both Kennedy and Megan, for the presentation. So that concludes the presentation part of this session. Just a reminder, if you do have questions, there is a few minutes now. Just put down your question in the chat box, and the team will come back with the responses at our next Q&A session on Thursday. So this has been the third session. Of course, the format that was originally set was an information session, a Q&A, second information session, and then the final Q&A, all leading up to the decision that will be made at the Special Chiefs Assembly on August 28th, next Wednesday. So I'd like to thank everyone that's participated. The session has been recorded, so it will be available on the website to go back and get the information that has been presented. Also, the information packages have been emailed to community leadership, so everybody should have a copy of the information that we've gone through. So again, a big thanks to Megan and Kennedy. I see Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse has joined us, who provided some opening comments by video and joins us here as we wrap up for closing comments. And then following the closing comments, I'm going to ask Stella to close the session with a prayer. So with that, Deputy Grand Chief, for your comments, and thanks for being able to join us.
Bonjour, Wattier. Yes, I'm back, and I'd like to thank you, Adam, for facilitating this meeting, and also to Megan and Kennedy for leading you through this very important information regarding the final settlement agreement. And yes, it's an overwhelming task. I know it's at times to really look at the particulars of what this is going to mean for Anishinaabe Nation communities, our children, youth, and families, and our agencies, and we have to look really at all sides of the whole picture, I think. And I think by way of these information sessions, it gives an opportunity for our First Nations leadership and our community members, and to really take a look at what is going to happen, and what could be the possible implications of accepting it, and what are some of the implications of not accepting it. You know, we are in a time of change right now, and we have to be very cognizant of you know, the changing environments as well, and also like really looking at how, if approved, what's some of the work that needs to happen. I know there has to be more coordinated discussions with our First Nations, especially our agencies, and also all these new and budding initiatives that are being undertaken. I really acknowledge a lot of the work that's happening across Anishinaabe Nation with the advent and the creation of support services like band reps, First Nations reps, also the prevention dollars that are they're going ahead. I know that there's great initiatives happening. I think the FSA will also provide some more breathing room in terms of really looking at ways to really develop and strengthen a lot of those areas. But it's up to you, chiefs and leaderships that are out there. We really encourage you to ask questions. Our staff is here to be at your service, to get all that technical information to you and answer any questions that you may have. The chat line is open for questions, but also we are having a dedicated Q&A session this Thursday. So we'll have another opportunity for you to ask all those questions and what does it mean, and what are some areas that we need to really prepare for in moving ahead, whether or not the FSA does it get approved by Chiefs and Assembly, or if it's not approved. So there's different pathways that we really need to take into consideration. And I applaud all of you. I applaud all the staff that's here, and also all of you that are working within the communities in the front lines and helping your First Nation communities really overcome some of those systemic barriers to really work with our First Nations children, youth, and families and trying to make better opportunities for them. So with that, miigwech, I look forward to hearing all the questions, and on Thursday as well, and also being prepared for our special Chiefs Assembly that we'll be posting as well for next week. So that's very important as well. So with that, I'll say miigwech, and I'll hand it over back to Adam. Thank you.
Great, miigwech, Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse, for those comments and summarizing some of the discussion points, but also reminding everybody that we do have the Q&A session on Thursday, 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 o'clock Central, and that'll be the final out of 4 specific sessions that have been organized leading up to the Special Chiefs Assembly, as the deputy indicated, next Wednesday, August the 28th. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for participating, and a big thanks to Megan Daniel with Faulkner's, Kennedy Ling with Anishinaabe Nation, and of course, Julian Faulkner has been standing by on the phone as well. I'd like to say miigwech to the team. And at this point, I will turn it over to Stella Shimon.